Welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and with me now you have your other host, Captain Ron. We have a great show for you tonight. We are going to celebrate the 100th birthday of John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, who was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Today we have an expert in studio to talk about the 100th birthday of John F. Kennedy. Dr. James Fetzer is with us today. We're so excited to have him in studio. And Dr. Fetzer, he has written books about JFK, including Assassination Science, Experts Speak Out on the Death of JFK, JFK Who, How, and Why. There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and we hope that Dr. James Fetzer can answer some of those today. We're so excited to have him in studio. So please welcome to Truth Be Told in studio, Dr. James Fetzer. That's right, that's right. He was co-host before, now he's in the hot seat. He gets to answer some questions. How you doing, sir?
Love it, Tony, being here with you and Captain Ron. Too bad our colleague,
I know,
Dean Ryan, can't be here as well, but it's just a real pleasure for me to be with you right here in L.A.
Well, you're here in L.A. for not just to see us, but you're here for a reason.
Mostly to see us, Tony.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
But aside from that,
First things first.
Right. But this coming Monday, you're going to be down south here in Orange County.
That's right. That's right.
And tell us what you're going to be doing.
Well, it's a major event. Lorian Fenton, who has managed many conferences, in fact, administered my fifth national conference in Santa Barbara in 2013 on the occasion of the 50th, which you can find online at JFK at 50, The Assassination of America, had the inspiration to do something to celebrate his birthday, but also bring the latest research on his death to the American people through a television live stream event. We have 9 speakers participating, and it's going to be very, very significant. Interesting, Roger Stone, who's published a book, Who Killed Kennedy, JFK, the case against LBJ, is one of those speakers. But there are many others like Barr McClellan, who published Blood, Money, Power, about where he was a member of the firm of Joe Clark, most powerful attorney in Texas, who had Lyndon as a client and who helped to arrange the assassination and then the cover-up. You're going to have Ed Haslam, who's the author of Dr. Mary's Monkey, which is a study of the activities in New Orleans involving Lee Oswald, Judith Very, David Ferry, under the supervision of Dr. Mary Sherman in developing a rapid-acting cancer that would serve as a bioweapon, where they used to talk about Mary, Ferry, and Very being involved in all of this. Fascinating stuff. You're going to have many other experts who are going to speak that are going to be quite fascinating, and including Larry Rivera, by the way, who has done some of the most brilliant recent research about JFK, including rediscovering interviews that had been conducted by Fred Newcomb, who was an early generation student of the assassination, with the 4 motorcycle escort officers and their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, where Larry has produced 2 YouTube documentaries about these findings, which are quite significant. One entitled The JFK Horseman, then The JFK Horseman Part 2 you can track down. It's going to be a rather sensational event the evening before, on Sunday, John Barber's film about the second assassination of JFK by the American media is going to be shown. You can get all the details online at jfkbirthday.com. And Judith Very Baker herself actually has been invited to speak there as well. She's a fascinating person in and of her own right. And was even made the subject of the Part 8 of The Men Who Killed Kennedy by the famous British producer-director Nigel Turner, who had thoroughly vetted her story, just as did Ed Haslam in preparing Dr. Mary's Monkey. So what her work does, Tony and Ron, is to humanize Lee Oswald, gives you a 3-dimensional picture of this guy rather than the single-dimension caricature where he's alleged to be the lone demented gunman and all that. Mm-hmm. Frankly, Larry has done work that will blow you away, that you will see on Monday. proving that, in fact, Lee Oswald was in the doorway of the book depository when the motorcade went past. This is the deepest secret of the Warren Commission of all, which means he not only cannot have been the lone demented gunman, he cannot have even been one of the shooters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Listen, the JFK thing is one of the, it's over 50-year conspiracy now that people have been talking about. There's been 1,000 different theories. I think you've probably been studying this for 50 years, I would guess, right? This has always been one of your...
Well, I was first lieutenant in the Marine Corps when Jack was whacked. I was anchored out in the USS Iwo Jima in Kaohsiung Harbor, which is a LPH, landing platform helicopter. When you got a helicopter carrier, it doesn't have to have a deep keel like a normal carrier because these aren't fixed-wing aircraft that need a long, stable surface to land and take off. Helicopters just going vertically up and down, and the officer of the deck awakened me at 3:30 in the morning to tell me that Jack had been shot, and then an hour later he awakened me again to tell me that they caught the guy had done it and he was a communist. I thought then that was pretty fast work, and of course today I know exactly why, but who would have ever imagined that I would wind up devoting so much of my life to bring together the best experts to ever study the case? You mentioned assassination science. That was my first book, collaborative research, 1998. World Authority on the Human Brain, who was also an expert on wound ballistics. He'd supervised an emergency medical hospital in the Battle of Okinawa for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war, and a World Authority on the Human Brain. A PhD in physics. He was also an MD board certified in radiation oncology, so he's an expert in the interpretation of X-rays. Chuck Crenshaw, one of the physicians who was actually in Trauma Room 1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in, and then 2 days later was responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald. Jack White, legendary photo film analyst, another PhD in physics. John P. Costello, who has a specialty in electromagnetism, the properties of light and of images of moving objects, who did an astounding assessment of the internal qualities of the extant version of the Zapruder film and gave it like a 98% perfect rating, but it turns out that 2% is terribly significant, and I'll be addressing it on Monday. The first two I mentioned, by the way, were Bob Livingston, MD, who was the scientific director of two of the National Institutes of Health at the time of the assassination, which happens to be located across the street from Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the autopsy would be conducted, and who called the physician who would conduct the autopsy, Commander James Humes, to explain to him that he'd heard from radio reports, these were also on television, that JFK had a small, clean puncture wound to the throat. And he explained to Humes that meant it was very important to dissect the neck because, and I find this so ironic in retrospect, if there were any evidence of shots from the rear, then there had to be at least two shooters and hence a conspiracy. Would you believe the FBI interrupted this conversation between two scientists, physicians about the autopsy of the President of the United States, and the FBI cut them off? And the other, the PhD MD, is David W. Mantik, who's the world's leading expert on the medical evidence. And in the two successor books I published then, Murder in Dealey Plaza 2000, David had three brilliant essays, one of the most wonderful synthesis of all the medical evidence I've ever read, one on the silence of the historians, why historians are unwilling to address the evidence about the death of JFK, and a third about the Zapruder film. There were other excellent essays in there. And then third, the Great Zapruder Film Hoax, published in 2003, 6 experts taking apart the film from every direction. Now, because of Larry's research, we have new information about the limo stop, for which there were massive witnesses, and I think anyone with an interest in JFK is not going to want to miss this event live stream on Monday, beginning at 9 a.m. Pacific.
That sounds amazing, right, Tony? It sounds like something we need to see, right?
And I think we should, go through some of the information.
Right, share a little bit with our audience. Let us have a little peek.
Well, sure. Actually, this is all in anticipation. This will give you the big picture about the assassination. If you go to slide number 1, what we're looking at is Dealey Plaza. But there are many buildings there that the public, by and large, is unaware that have a significant role to play. Notice you have Main Street. I'll talk about this, but the motorcade was diverted off of Main Street onto Houston and then 110 degree back onto Elm Street, which is a violation of Secret Service protocol. But notice there the county records building, and you probably never even thought about it before. That building in the background between the book depository on the left and the county records is a Dow Tex. That turns out to be very important. What we're seeing is the official scenario of 3 shots being fired from the 6th floor window on the east side of the book depository. I'll explain why, in fact, no shots were fired from that location. Number 2 shows where Abraham Zapruder was located, standing atop a low colonnade to take his motion picture. Number 1 is where JFK is supposed to have suffered the fatal wound. It was actually a little further down, closer to the steps. 3, 4, 5 are locations where shooters appear to have been located. Number 6 actually is where a distant bystander by the name of James Tague was injured when a shot, and I'll explain, was fired that missed and hit the sidewalk and caused a chunk of concrete came up and cut his cheek. And it was because of that injury they couldn't deny there'd been a shot that had missed.
Right.
Now get this, even most Americans don't know this either. The day of the shooting, both the Secret Service and the FBI agreed there had been 3 shots with 3 hits. The jack had been hit in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column. Connolly had been hit in the back, and the jack had been hit in the back of the head, killing him. So that it was when they discovered that James Tague had been injured by a shot that missed, they had to revise their position, subtract one of the shots, and invent what has been widely lampooned, the magic bullet theory, the idea that a single round had gone through Jack.
Well, hold on. Yeah, that's what we all think. All of us that have just a little knowledge of this, the whole conspiracy is not that there was just one shooter, that there had to be a second shooter. That's already like a big deal, that there was a second shooter, not just Oswald. But you're saying that evidence points to you that there's 6 different shooters at the same time.
There's 6 I have been able to identify, and I'll explain the circumstance. Because when you look at the sponsors and so forth, it's as though each of the groups who were involved in the assassination put up a shooter of their own. So they'd all be tied together, as it were, in a blood oath. So if one of them were exposed, it would threaten to expose the rest of them. This was part of the way they cemented silence among all the participants.
There's no coincidence. This is a orchestrated effort between whoever, mob and government. They're all together at the same time.
Well, they didn't all meet in Washington Stadium. You know, You had the key player who had contacts with all these parties, including the Secret Service, who turns out to be Lyndon Baines Johnson. I mean, I mentioned Roger's book about who killed JFK, the case against LBJ. I'll tell you how bad it is. Lyndon actually forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960. He wasn't on Bobby or Jack's long list, much less their short. But when Bobby came by, after Jack had already invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate, but given him the night to think it over, Bobby went by the Johnson suite and just made a pro forma gesture, never imagining Lyndon would have any interest to give up his powerful position as majority leader of the Senate. Instead, Lyndon jumped on it, and to their consternation, he threatened to reveal that JFK had Addison's disease, was not expected to live a long, healthy life, that he'd had dalliances with beautiful women, some of whom were spies for East Germany. And moreover, he assured Bobby that if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposal sent down from the White House would be dead on arrival because he, as majority leader, would bottle them up. Jack and Bobby anguished over this, but couldn't figure a way out and were forced to accept him on the ticket. Sequel. One of Johnson's powerful financial supporters burst into the Johnson suite, having learned Lyndon was going to run with JFK, cursing and swearing they was going to help elect Kennedy to the White House. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later state publicly that JFK would not live out his term and would die a violent death. And get this. LBJ sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination.
It's pretty common now. It's out there that Johnson was so cutthroat and he wanted to get what he was going to get anyway. So it points to him.
Well, there's a completely brilliant book by Phil Nelson entitled LBJ Mastermind of JFK's Assassination. You just read the first few chapters about LBJ's life and you see, man, this guy was ruthless. He was relentless,
totally ruthless,
absolutely ambitious. suspicious. He had the uncanny gift of sizing up a man virtually from meeting him. He could tell his strengths and weaknesses. He was a master manipulator.
Wow.
And, of course, he acquired allegiance from a host of people who just thought Johnson was the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Well, I was going to say allegiance, or were they just scared
Well,
of him?
It's a good question, Tony. Well, I'll tell you, it's very interesting. One of Lyndon's many mistresses was Madeline Duncan Brown. They began an affair in 1948.
Really?
She bore him a son, Stephen, in 1950. And during a conversation, she had a fascinating experience of being at the home of Clint Murchison Sr. the night before the assassination. Because of her relationship with LBJ, she was invited to many of these events.
Mm-hmm.
There were only a couple of dozen people there, but they included some heavy hitters. J. Edgar Hoover was there. She thought maybe this was one of many events they had in his honor because he'd stop in Dallas on his way to Del Mar, where there was a racetrack, and when Hoover put down a bet, his horse invariably won. Turned out the track was owned by Clint Murchison Sr., where the event was held. Richard Nixon was there. He was driven out by local Republican leader, worked in the same bank building where she was a young advertising executive. H.L. Hunt, nominally Murchison's opponent in the oil industry, was there. Richest man in the world. He put up these posters of JFK wanted for trees, and Madeline ran into him in the parking lot just before the president came to Dallas. And she said, H.L., you can't do that. And he said, sure I can. He said, I'm the richest man in the world. I can do anything I want. He was there. So was John J. McClory, who is our former High Commissioner to Germany and former Chief Executive Officer of Chase Manhattan Bank. George Brown, Brown and Root Heavy Construction was there when the war went down. Although Vietnam has many magnificent ports and didn't need another, Brown and Root was given $1 billion to dredge a new port at Cam Ranh Bay. I mean, it was of this order. So when Lyndon showed up late in the evening, unexpectedly to most, these heavy hitters disappeared into a boardroom for 15 or 20 minutes. And when it broke up and Lyndon strode toward her, she expected him to whisper sweet nothings in her ear. Instead, he told her in a hateful tone of voice he wasn't going to have to put up with embarrassment from those Kenny boys after tomorrow. That's not a threat. That's a promise.
Wow.
He even called her the following day and repeated exactly the same message. 6 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, they had a rendezvous in the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas. And
I know the Driscoll. I've been in there.
And Madeline confronted Lyndon with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he'd been involved since no one stood to gain more personally. And Lyndon blew up at her and told her the CIA and the oil boys had decided that Jack had to be taken out.
Wow.
We have a question from the chat room, and he wants to know.
Does he do all the voices? Or
He
just,
does.
Okay.
Okay. You can do Bugs Bunny if you want. When the Boston bombing happened, the same day JFK Library caught fire.
Yeah.
But he's like, nobody talked about it.
I
Why?
know. I think there's a connection there. I do think. It may have been even a cover story because we've cracked the Boston bombing. The alternative media did the day of the event. It was these Kraft International personnel wearing khaki trousers, black jackets, black baseball cap. We have photographs of one of them in the company of another moving toward a location where one of the bombs was set off. Both of the bombs were in black nylon backpacks. Mm-hmm. One had a white square sewn on it. This guy's wearing a black nylon backpack with a white square. The bomb's there to explode, so you're seen running away, no longer wearing the black nylon backpack with a white square. It was these Kraft International people who set it up. There were two of these backpacks, the FBI in their official report, and the indictment for Zoker, the younger of the brothers, in court, both stated that the backpacks were black nylon. But in fact, they photoshopped the images of the boys in at the marathon. I was contacted by their aunt, Mirette, who's in fact a lawyer. She's got a law degree from the University of Moscow, who explained to me how she knew. Because I said, well, how can you tell? And she said, because he had a beard. But in this photoshopped image, he's clean shaven. So I said, well, can you prove it? And she said, yeah. She sent me a photograph of him lying in bed with his cat. He had a beard. A link to the two of them working out shortly before the marathon. He's got a beard. He had lunch with a friend who called him after the marathon, relieved to find they were nowhere in the vicinity. They had dinner together that night. He had a beard. There's convenience store footage when they're trying to track him down. Zoker's inside. He's outside. He's got a beard. The police arrest him in Watertown. They strip him naked, put him in the back of a police car. He's got a beard. Now, I could have identified him, but how much better that his mother and his aunt identified him. The next time we see him, he's dead with a huge gash in his side. He's still got a beard. Now, the brother was accused of having killed him, but it's preposterous. He was taken into police custody, and then he turns up dead. In fact, we have a witness saying she watched them drive over him 3 times in a black SUV that appears to be his own car. She watched the police drive over him 3 times, and that appears to be exactly what happened. But get this. When they photoshopped him in, they made a mistake because neither of them is wearing a black nylon backpack.
I'm showing a picture now of him walking down the street.
Yeah, very good. That's right. No black nylon backpack.
Yep.
Good work.
Here's one that somebody actually put together, and it shows the backpack. There's nothing. There's no white at all.
Very good. That's excellent. That's an excellent collage. Now, I asked a retired professor of law, John Remington Graham, what was the most powerful evidence we had, and he said it was that the backpacks don't match, which meant there wasn't even probable cause for an arrest, much less an indictment or a conviction at trial.
Now, the viewer was asking them about the JFK fire that day at the library.
Yeah. I think that's very significant. I do not know now, but I have inquired what actually was damaged. It could be very significant as some crucial piece of evidence to cover up what I'm about to review with you now. But if you have if you go to the next slide, for example, see, these are 15 indications of how the Secret Service set them up. 2 agents were left behind at Love Field by Emory Roberts, who was the agent in charge, riding in the Secret Service Cadillac. These guys would have been beside the presidential limo, running beside it, or riding on the back. They were left behind. If you go to the next slide, you'll find the motorcycle escort was cut down to 4, and they were ordered not to ride in front of the rear wheels. One of the officers said it was the damnedest formation he'd ever seen. Notice the officers here, but because I'll return to them later. If you go to the next slide, what's wrong here? We got the crowd spilling out into the street. The manhole covers were not welded shut. They didn't even cover the open windows. Look at that. That's one of the most important responsibilities for the Secret Service. Cover the windows. Check out everyone inside. This is why they lay down a route and they never change it. In this case, the 110th Military Intelligence Unit, which should have been distributed through the city for crowd control, was ordered to stand down against the adamant opposition of its commanding officer. And look at the next. If you want to be stunned by the failure of security, I mean, look, a guy with a handgun in the bus could have shot JFK dead right there on the spot. I mean, there's no way in which they were affording security for the president of the United States. I mean, this is absolutely
So this sounds like this
stunning.
goes beyond just one department.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm going to go through. Yeah, and I'll fill you in. But I mean, yeah. This is just how the Secret Service set them up, see? Because, I mean, this is why L. Fletcher Prouty, who was a liaison between the CIA and the Pentagon for covert activities, was sent to South America. He would have taken one look at any of this and seen it was all completely wrong, that it was a setup to assassinate the president. Look at the next. They actually changed the motorcade route 4 days before the event. You could have gone straight up Main Street and got onto the Stemmons Freeway to get to the location where he would speak. They actually changed it from the Women's Forum, which was very secure, to the Trade Mart, which had lots of balconies, exits, and entrances to justify this change, which wasn't necessary anyway. But it put him right in front of the book depository. In other words, they were bringing the target to the patsy for assassination.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly what was going on here.
Wow.
If you turn to the next, this, in my opinion, is the single most telling. They had all the vehicles in the wrong order. The presidential limousine ought to have been in the middle, preceded by the mayor, then the vice president, so you get the crowd waving for the lower-ranking dignitaries. What they did was put him out in front, so it would be easier for the shooters to tell exactly where he was. They gave Jackie a huge bouquet of red roses. That had a double indication. Everywhere else she'd been given yellow roses. Well, they gave Nellie Connolly yellow roses, but they gave Jackie red, which not only identified where she was, but also was a sign that she must not be harmed. She must not be harmed. There was a huge argument that morning, by the way, between Lyndon and JFK. Lyndon wanted to get John Connally out of the limousine and Ralph Yarborough, who was a liberal Texas senator that Lyndon despised, in. But Jack overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States.
Right.
And it went forward. So you see in all these festive occasions before the motorcade, before they actually get going, Connally has a grimace. See, it was too late. The
But
decision
didn't
was too late to get the word to the shooter.
But
So
didn't Conley even think there was more than one, or did he?
Oh, he calls out when he's hit. He says, "My God, they're going to kill us all." Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
He says that.
Yeah.
But the fact is, from a political point of view, it actually helped to obfuscate what was going on here, which was actually a coup d'etat, because no one would imagine that Lyndon would put John Conley, his crony, his campaign manager, in harm's way. But the way it panned out, he was unable to avoid it.
Right.
So this is the single most telling significance. They even took the president's personal physician, put him in the last vehicle. They took the president's military aide, who normally would have been riding in the front seat between the driver, William Greer, and the agent in charge, Roy Kellerman, and put him in that vehicle with the president's personal physician for a reason I will explain. Here's another. At Parkland Hospital, one of the agents got a bucket of sponge and water, started cleaning the blood and brains out of the limousine. Now, that's destroying a crime scene.
Wow, right away. It's amazing.
It's a crime scene on wheels. And when a number of those there noticed this through and through a bullet hole from front to rear, they got upset and they moved the limo where no one could observe it, So, and here you can actually see the bullet hole. Look at the next.
It was taken a Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for some reason.
Well, what happened? What would be happen is that the limousine would be taken back to Ford Motor Company on Monday, the day of the formal state funeral, torn down to bare metal and the windshield replaced, which explains the difference between the left and the right. The left is actually the bullet hole. See that small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, where JFK's left ear would be if his left ear were visible. We have a guy who's gone through junkyards in the South firing high-powered rifles through windshields, and he finds not only does he create a small spiral nebula like this, but it makes the sound of a firecracker, which is significant because many of the spectators said the first shot sounded different. It sounded like a firecracker. Well, it was actually not the first shot, but it was passing through the windshield that set up. They replaced the windshield. We've even tracked down the official at Ford responsible for replacing the windshield. So it was a clean windshield, but the Secret Service produced this. Bob Livingston, I mentioned before, scientific director, National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Blindness, had discovered the Secret Service had ordered 20 windshields they claimed for target practice, where they used one of them to simulate this hole by hitting it with a fragment from behind to make it look as though this had done this fragment, but it's not the through-and-through bullet hole. That was part of the cover-up.
Wow.
Yeah. If you go to the next slide, this is actually frame 225. The one after that, Tony. Yeah, you can actually see the hole in the windshield. See, in the Zapruder film, it's one they failed to notice at the time, and it got through. Though they did a massive amount of editing of the film, as I'm going to explain on Monday. This is something they overlooked.
Because, I mean, I grew up shooting, and you couldn't, if you're shooting from the rear, that wouldn't have been there.
Right, that's right. And I'll talk about the location. I'll go through each of the shooters and where they were located, the shots they fired, and the effects they achieved. The next is that during a press conference that was held at 3:15, I think that's Eastern time, and it was actually, at 1 o'clock. He was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock Central time. And they had a Parkland press conference during which Malcolm Perry, the physician on the right, explained that he had a small, clean puncture wound to the throat, where he conducted a tracheostomy incision through it, but it was very clean. In fact, if you look at the very next slide, you'll find what Charles Crenshaw drew for me about the wound at its appearance at Parkland. Now, during this press conference, he 3 times described this wound as having been caused by a bullet that was coming at him. It was a wound of entry, but of course fired from in front. So they couldn't allow that to stand. So the transcript of the Parkland press conference was not given to the Warren Commission. So they wouldn't know that the physician who'd actually operated on JFK had identified it as a wound of entry 3 different times. 3 different times. If you go to the next, you see what we have here is a summation of the wounds that JFK sustained. From the back, actually at 5.5 inches below the collar, was, as I'm going to explain, fired from the county records building. And then the shot to the back of the head from the Dow Tex. And I'm going to go through all this in detail.
Wait, so how many times did he get hit? 4?
David thinks there might have been a 3rd shot to the head, which would be in total of 5.
Total of 5.
At
6
least,
shooters, 5 hits.
Right. I'm going to explain the misses. I'll go through the whole bit so you know exactly what happened here. But the fact is, they couldn't accommodate these shots from in front. So that what they would maintain in order to explain it away, they would ignore the entry wound in the right temple. They enlarged the back wound at Bethesda. The physician Humes actually took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarged the wound. But would you believe there were 2 witnesses who watched it, including Thomas Evans Robinson, who was the mortician who prepared the body for a funeral. He watched him use a cranial saw to enlarge the wound of JFK's back of the head, and they messed with the throat wound to make it. Bob Livingston was called by Humes asking what would it look like if it was an exit instead of an entrance.
Right.
And Bob explained, and they messed with it to try and make it look like what Bob had explained it would look like. So what they would do with the magic bullet, see, when they discovered that one shot had missed, is they'd raise the location of the back wound out to the base of the neck, okay? Claim it had gone through and exited the throat. So now you account for the throat wound. Now you got a wound from the back, but it's no longer, 5.5 inches below. Gerald Ford changed that description as a member of the commission. And it was done in time for me to, when I did Assassination Science, include a copy of an article in the New York Times explaining how Gerald Ford had changed the location of the wound. David Mandick, by the way, has been able to prove by taking a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions, creating a CAT scan and plotting the official trajectory, that it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. So when you see these specials like on ABC or, Discovery Channel, whatnot, and they show the trajectory of the magic bullet, they're leaving out a distinctive anatomical feature of their stand-in. Typically, there's their molds out of gelatin and whatnot. They have no backbone, which is all completely ironic because the reason Jack Kennedy was assassinated was because he had no backbone. Because he had backbone. So it's not even anatomically possible. So much for the magic bullet. Now, if you go to the next slide, you see these are some of the frames where they blacked out the wound at the back. In fact, you see that reddish stuff. They seem to have even moved it from the back of the head to the side. You'll notice how very dark it is at the back of the head. If you go forward, it occurred to me that it might be possible they'd overlook that the wound was visible later on, and I found it in frame 374. See there? That pink thing is a bone flap.
Which one is it?
Yeah, right there.
Okay.
That pink thing is a bone flap that was blown open, and we'll find the description in the mortician's summary. But look at the blue-gray matter. Remember gray matter for brain matter? So this is very much where the wound is present that they overlooked. If you go to the next slide, then you see a comparison between the earlier frames where it's been blacked out and where you can actually see it, and where they appear to have moved, what there was of the blowout in the forward to the side. But look at the bottom left especially, how distinctively they had blacked it out. In fact, there's a group of Hollywood film restoration experts who've been looking at what's called the forensic copy of the Zapruder film. I've been in the studio. This is brilliant stuff. You cannot believe the detail. And they've all been aghast at the primitive way in which they blacked out this wound at the back of the head.
That's interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, you'll see there was this fist-sized blowout at the back of the head, which we had physician after physician describing at Parkland. And David Mandick, you see, with his expertise in radiology and interpretation x-rays, went into the National Archives. This was already November, December 1992. And discovered they'd patched it. Look at this area in the middle. He calls it area P for patch. And this, look out how much it corresponds to the blowout, as you can see it in frame 374. Well, of course, there's some hair hanging over, but it's very, very similar in its characteristics. If you go to the next slide, this is very, very important because in number 1, the circle, you can see that through and through hole in the windshield. Jack's already clutching his throat from the bullet that hit him there. Right. Number 2 is a figure that has been believed to be Lee Oswald. Harold Weisberg, one of the earliest in his photographic whitewash in 1966, explained in the last few pages how the Warren Commission staff was covering up that this was Lee Oswald in the doorway. Even Jim Garrison, who is immortalized in Oliver Stone's film JFK, had concluded that was indeed Lee Oswald in the doorway. In the back there, number 3 in the stairway.
You say that's Oswald in the doorway there? You can see it on this photograph?
Yes. And we'll prove it. You'll see it Monday. You'll see Larry Rivera will prove it. You'll be blown away. You will be blown away because there's no doubt about it. I mean, not only is he the right height, the weight, build, shirt, and T-shirt as Lee Oswald when he was arrested, But we've been able to identify the facial features by looking at the only alternative to Lee, Billy Lovelady, who's actually there beside him. See that man with his arms upraised?
Is this because of new technology? 'Cause
Yes,
we're able to-
yes,
really?
yes, new
Interesting.
digital technology. It's absolutely brilliant. So this is one of the most significant discoveries in the history of assassination research. And then look at number 3. See, surrounded there by the fire escape? That's a wound. That's the window to a broom closet for a uranium mining company that was a CIA asset, from which 3 shots were fired with an unsilenced Mannlicher Carcano.
See,
This
that
is
angle would be more.
this is the only unsilenced weapon that was used, Tony.
Right.
And then you see Lyndon's door is already open. His Secret Service is responding, while the Jack Secret Service is looking around. They have no idea what's going on. Some of them even appear to be looking at Lee also, because he wasn't supposed to be there. Now, if you look at the next slide, you see what actually took place here in terms of the totality of shots that were taken. One or actually 2 appear to have been done from the top of the county records building, 3 from the Dow Tex, 2 from the book depository, or maybe even 3 from the opposite side firing at Conley in the mistaken belief it was Ralph Yarborough. You got the one from the, that missed and injured the distant bystander. That's a yellow. But another that actually that arrow properly would be from inside the triple underpass, because you got these 3 roadways coming together. Then there's a shot from the grassy knoll that missed because it would have injured Jackie Kennedy. So he pulled his shot, it wound up in the grass. And then the fatal shot here from the corner of the intersection of the triple underpass and the triple underpass and the picket fence. There's an above-ground sewer opening, perfect cover if you had a little camouflage. That was the shot. Even the shooter has admitted he fired that shot. I'll get to it. So if you look here now, these are the shooters I've
But you have the guy that did it claim that he did it?
admitted he did it when he was arrested coming to New York to murder Marita Lorenz, who'd been a mistress of Fidel Castro, who knew what was going down so she couldn't testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, by Detective Jim Rothstein, a Gold Shield detective and a colleague of his. The other detective put his 38 on his chest, and Jim put his in his mouth, and they took him into custody. I'll tell you more about it when I identify the name. Okay, but you can see how much of a turkey shoot this was.
Yeah, I'm surprised more people didn't get hit.
Right, Tony, good one.
Well, these were all really good marksmen. I mean, these were very high quality. And there
Well,
may
you
have
got how many yellow? There are 2 misses?
8, 9, or 10 shots.
8, 9, or 10 shots and 5 hits. That's ish.
Yeah, 4 to 5 hits. That's
So
right.
then you got 3 or 4 bullets flying around like Tony's bringing up.
Oh yeah. Well, even Jack's buddy, who was in the Secret Service limousine, said it was a turkey shoot. There were bullets buzzing all over the place when he was talking with Tip O'Neill, had been the Speaker of the House, and Tip said, well, that's not what you said to the Warren Commission.
Right.
and he sheepishly admitted, yeah, well, the family wanted to get it behind him. And can you imagine? This was Kenny O'Donnell, I think, who made that concession. I mean, just unbelievable how they were covering it up. Okay, so here's the first shooter I've identified. This is Harry Weatherford Jr. He was a deputy sheriff working for the Dallas Sheriff's Department, firing from the top of the county records building using a 30-06, which is a higher caliber than a Mannlicher Carcano, to implant a Mannlicher Carcano bullet into the back of a JFK. This is the bullet that entered 5.5 inches below the collar, went in about 2.5, the second knuckle on your little finger, no exit. Using a silencer, he obtained a custom-made silencer just a week or 10 days before the shooting.
Right.
When asked about it, did he shoot JFK? He says, "I shoot lots of sons of bitches." That was how he responded.
Wow.
Yeah. Here's the next. This is Jack Lawrence, a U.S. Air Force expert who was actually working for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the presidential motorcade, which was different than any other presidential motorcade. Normally, they're all uniform Lincoln black Cadillacs. This was all different makes, colors, and models because they wanted to know exactly who everyone was, where they were in the motorcade. So they set it up. He worked for that dealership. After the shooting, he came back all muddy and vomiting. He'd made his way through a sewer system under Dallas, which is very extensive, back to the dealership. Yeah. And, he appears to have fired the shot that went through the windshield that hit Jack in the throat.
Really?
Yeah. From inside the triple underpass.
Now, are these people? Were they part of one of the government departments, or was this like a hired?
When
assassin?
I get to the sponsors, you'll see they seem to have each put up their own guy, so that they were all tied together by. So you got a deputy sheriff. I'm going to explain. You got a Dallas policeman. You got an Air Force guy. You got Lyndon's personal hitman. So I mean, they were all tied together by the actual shooters that participated in the assassination. Go to the next, number 3. This is most interesting. This is Nestor Tony Escadro. This was an anti-Castro Cuban recruited by the CIA. He fired 3 shots from the Dow text using a Mannlicher Carcano, the only unsilenced weapon that was used in the assassination, with 2 misses and 1 hit. One missed and injured the distant bystander, James Tigg. Another missed and hit a chrome strip above the windshield. But the third, after the driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to a left and to a halt, hit JFK in the back of the head. He slumped forward. Jackie, as the backup, was looking right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium with such force that when they hit Officer Hargis riding to the left, where he initially thought he himself had been shot. Now, it's interesting here is if you go down to Freedom Park in Little Havana, they have 2 statues in Freedom Park. One is to Jose Marti, who freed Cuba from Spanish domination. The other is to Nestor Tony Escadro, of whom no one has ever heard. But if someone in the know, asks, what's that doing there? They'll just say, he took care of business.
Wow.
Because they believed, you see, that Jack had betrayed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs. And the CIA allowed them to entertain that belief. It wasn't right, but that's what they believed, and therefore they wanted retribution. Here's the next, number 4. This is Roscoe White. He was a Dallas police officer with ties to the CIA. Fired a shot from the grassy knoll. It was the simplest, easiest shot, but it appears he would have hit Jackie, so he pulled it. It wound up in the grass. We have photographs of a lieutenant picking the bullet out from the grass, but it disappears. It's never seen again. What's most interesting about this guy is that Jim Mars and I did an article about framing the Patsy, the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, which we were going through the backyard photograph to show how it had been faked. And when we got to the question of identifying who'd stood in for Lee, Jim noticed that he had a funny bump on his arm. I mean, a very discernible bump on his arm. Clearly, this isn't Lee. He's got a blocked chin, not Lee's rather pointed chin. There's an insert line between the chin and the lower lip. His fingertips of his right hand are cut off. He's holding 2 communist newspapers, a worker and the militant, which had very divergent communist philosophies, so that members of one encountering the other would have fistfights and try to kill each other. So it'd be odd that Lee would have this. Jack White noticed that they have known dimensions, the newspaper, so you can use it as internal ruler. And when he laid it off from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head, he discovered the individual by that yardstick was too short, only about 5'6", whereas Lee was about 5'10", which means either they used someone too short, or alternatively, which is the explanation, I believe, when they put in the newspapers to fake this photograph, they put him in a little too big.
Really?
Yeah, and threw it off.
This is so fascinating.
Now go next. Now
It just could go so many different ways, though. This is
so wonderful. This is Malcolm Wallace. This was Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman. He was firing from the west side of the book depository at Senator Ralph Yarborough, he thought, but it was actually John Connally, in the mistaken belief it was Ralph Yarborough. He fired 2 or 3 shots. Connally was hit in the back by a bullet, but he also had a wound in his wrist. He also had a bullet wound up in his thigh. And Dr. Robert Shaw, by name, oddly enough, when shown the magic bullet, he thought that was most unlikely to have gone through John Connally and done all this damage because he had removed more metal from John Connally's wrist alone than was missing from the magic bullet.
There you go.
So
was he related to George Wallace?
No, but he's an interesting guy. He murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters.
Really?
Oh, yeah. She was too talkative.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, fascinating. Here's number 6. This is a guy you've been interested in, Frank Sturgis, later complicit in a Watergate robbery, appears to have been connected by the CIA, fired from the north end of the Triple Underpass. And as I said, Jim Rothstein and his colleague arrested him, and he gave him the throwaway line, "Good shooting." And Sturgis admitted he'd participated in the assassination and said he did it because Kennedy had betrayed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs and because he was cavorting with women spies for other nations. In one version, he actually said that he was aiming for his eye, but JFK missed, which is a typical mob hit. But he moved slightly and he hit him in the temple instead. But I've interviewed Jim Rothstein about this and other issues. And in fact, that should now be up. If you go to Gary King's YouTube channel, you can find it there.
Perfect.
Now, there may have been yet another shooter in the vicinity of the pergola, because there you have 4 shots, but you had, about 8 misses. I mean, you had the 2 misses from the Dow Tex, and you had the miss from the grassy knoll. And you put it together, get 8, 9, or 10 shots, depending how many were fired at John Connolly. Right. But here's the key thing to understand the assassination in the very next slide, Tony. You have to distinguish between the sponsors, the facilitators, and the mechanics. Now, I've been going through the mechanics. The shooters are supervisors and coordinators. There's a lot more to be said about this, but believe it or not, George Herbert Walker Bush appears to have been in the Dow Tex coordinating the shooting team from that location, which, of course, was setting up the acoustical impression of 3 shots having been fired when none were fired from the book depository. When the HSCA would eventually reinvestigate, I talked with a fellow who'd studied this. They set up a series of microphones to only test from 2 locations. One was a grassy knoll, and the other was the vicinity of the book depository. And I said, would this be sufficiently discriminative between the Dow Tex and the book depository? He said, no, absolutely not. So what they did was to set up, and even the HSC was covering up. They were trying to recover what had actually happened, even in a more sophisticated way. Believe it or not, even though in the Bethesda autopsy report you have this description, mathematical description of this huge missing back of his head, after Commander Humes had taken the cranial saw to the skull of JFK.
Right.
The HSCA contracted it to a small wound at the top of the head. I mean, it's simply absurd. So you got 3 completely different versions of the back of the head wound, fist size from Parkland, which is accurate, corroborated by all the witnesses and by David's study of the autopsy evidence and my discovery of frame 374 and so forth. Then you had him enlarge the wound to try and make it, which is described in the Bethesda autopsy report. And then you have this contraction by the HSC. Well, I happen to know a guy who was a member of the medical panel, Cyril Weck, very famous guy. He's done all kinds of famous cases. And I called up Cyril and I said, Cyril, I've been studying the HSC and I cannot understand how you were able to contract the wound from the massive back of the head described in the autopsy report to the small wound at the top of the head. And Cyril said to me, I'll have to check my notes. I was dumbfounded. Now, we also have several photographs of Edward Lansdale. This was an Air Force general responsible for assassinations all over the world, especially in Vietnam. We see him walking past the 3 tramps. He's been identified by no less authorities than Fletcher Prouty and by Victor Krulak, one of the most famous Marine Corps generals, as Edward Lansdale. We have a photograph of George Herbert Walker Bush standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository. I discovered that photograph in Jesse Curry's paperback JFK assassination file. He went to be the head of security for 7-Eleven stores after he retired as chief of police in Dallas. And he published a very nice set of photographs. And to my knowledge, I was the first to recognize that was George Herbert Walker Bush. He'd actually been arrested coming out of the Dow Tex. He identified himself as an independent Houston oilman who was taken downtown in question. Meanwhile, W, who was actually on the scene, has wandered around looking. You won't believe it. He's lost. Where's his dad? Can you imagine taking your son to the scene of the assassination of the President of the United States? And then we have a third photograph where Bush is standing, where Lansdale is standing by waiting to speak to Bush. Richard Hook did the most brilliant article about this. It's called, Did George H.W. Bush Coordinate a JFK hit team? Richard Hook, Hooke. You can find it on my blog at jamesfetzer.blogspot.com, but it's also published in the new book about to appear now, my 4th book on JFK, Who, How, and Why, which will be out next week.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's great.
And how interesting that you have W in this, you have Herbert Walker Bush, and you have Ford.
But
3 guys that
and what
rode
about
to be president.
and what
come
about
into
J.
the
Edgar?
story.
We had a whole succession of presidents who would never assume that office, but for the death of JFK, Lyndon Johnson,
Right, for sure.
Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford. Nixon was at the ratification meeting, remember, at Clint Murchison's home the night before. And get this, when LBJ organized the Warren Commission, see, this was the power of the incoming president. He'd be able to control what happened. He assigned the FBI to be the sole investigative agency. And he and J. Edgar were in this up to their ears. Edgar was covering it up. They didn't even question the 10 closest witnesses to the limousine. The others who had important evidence, they didn't ask them a question to elicit deposit it. If by accident into the transcript got important information, they simply changed it. They changed the transcripts. So you had these two key players as the facilitators. Then you get to the sponsors, okay? And by the way, just to tie off on Lansdale, many of us believe, located the shooters and determined the sequence in which the shots would be taken. And by the way, there was a man with an umbrella who was pumping the umbrella up and down as you approach the Stemmons Freeway sign that it was a signal to the shooters, he's still alive, keep shooting. Keep shooting. And there's a guy identified, the Cuban, who comes out and shakes his fist, which is a sign to stop. And Greer pulls the limousine to the left so abruptly that the passengers are jostled forward to make sure Jack would be killed. Now, to go with the sponsors, you see, the CIA was involved because Jack was threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs were involved because he had not invaded Cuba, contrary to the unanimous recommendation. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, contrary to the unanimous opposition. Now he's going to pull our forces out of Vietnam, where they believed a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism.
Right.
I've already explained about the anti-Castro Cubans believing he'd betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs. Bobby was bringing about more indictments and convictions of mafia, where J. Edgar had never even acknowledged the existence of organized crime until the Joe Valachi hearings, when you described the structure of the Cosa Nostra in such detail, could no longer be denied, because just as Edgar had sex dossiers on the members of Congress, the mob had one on him in compromising positions with his close personal friend Clyde Tolson. So they had Edgar under control. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed, which was represented by John J. McCloy, who, by the way, would be appointed to one of the two civilian seats of the Warren Commission. So they had two senators, two representatives, and two civilians. But it was John J. McCloy and it was Allen Dulles, whom Jack had removed from the CIA for betraying him. So you had two real partisans, and where Dulles was leading for the single conspiracy.
Right.
You know, one guy said all these were American assassinations are always lone nuts, even though we have photographs of four of the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination being hung on the same gallows at the same time, and there were simultaneous attacks on Lincoln's vice president and his Secretary of State. I mean, this is how far Allen Dulles was willing to go to deceive the public and even members of the Warren Commission. So the Fed, see, Jack had instructed the Department of the Treasury to print hundreds of millions of United States notes on the ground that it was absurd that the government should be paying a consortium of private banks interest for printing the currency of the United States.
Yeah. Well, we have about 3 minutes left.
Yep, and believe it or not, we're right on schedule.
Good.
The Texas oilmen were worried Jack was going to cut the oil depletion allowance. He was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, a founder and the first PM of Israel, who wanted nuclear weapons. Jack was absolutely opposed. He asked the predecessor he had required, the World Jewish Congress, the precursor of the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, they call them Public Affairs Committee, to register as a foreign agent. And Ben-Gurion resigned in disgust and appears to have told the Mossad to go in with taking Jack out. If you go to the next slide, you see how close we are to the very end, because all this, you know, you're going to be fascinated by what comes out on Monday. I mean, this is a group of experts. The presentation by Larry Rivera, I guarantee, will knock your socks off. And it's going to be live streamed to cover the expense of production and televising. She's asking $30 for a pay-per-view.
Which is worth it.
But you get it for 6 months, Tony.
Yeah.
You get it for 6 months. So you can bring in your friends, your relative. You can go back, watch it again.
Right.
Begins at 9 a.m. on Monday. Go to jfkbirthday.com to get the details. And last but not least, here's my new book about JFK. And just look at some of the features here on the cover. Look at that second image on the left. That's the three different versions of the back of the head wound. The fist-size blowout, then the huge enlarged back of the head, and then the tiny contraction there. On the opposite it, of course, is the doorway area where we've been able to identify Lee Oswald. You can even tell from here they altered it because, look, the doorman is missing his left shoulder. It looks like he's got a towel over it. That's actually a man behind him, is both in front of him and behind him. And further over, there's a man whose face has been obfuscated. This was actually the guy the government wanted to claim was the man in the doorway, Billy Lovelay, holding his arms up. He thought it was odd they'd be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, and he was wearing a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt. So they had to obfuscate the shirt. And then up in the top left, you see on the back cover, this is part of Larry's work in applying mathematical principles to identify the man in the doorway. And, of course, the very famous Alchin's photograph we've been discussing. So this
is fascinating. I can't wait to see it. I'm going to watch it on Monday.
Folks, he names names. There you go. At least he tells you exactly who the shooters were, who they are, where they were.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
A lot more details than most can give. And like you said, it's a fascinating subject. It's like he's over 50 years now that we're still talking about this, and I think it's going to continue on and on. When is the records that finally
Well,
get
you see, most of them are actually out in the wake of Oliver Stone's film JFK.
Right.
The Congress passed the JFK Records Act that overrode the 75-year moratorium, which had been imposed because the average life of an American is 75 years. So they wanted everyone who was alive at the time to be dead. But they went out and they released 60,000 documents, millions of pages. There's a small amount left. We don't know exactly because we don't know how much was there to begin with. It's yet to be released, but includes at least one figure, George Ioannidis, who was a PSYOPs guy who appears to be involved in both JFK and Bobby. And the CIA has been holding it back. By law, they're supposed to release all this stuff, but they've been holding it back. This book, by the way, has over 550 pages and over 1,000 photographs, including all the frames to the Zapruder film.
This is why we keep asking him back. Well, we have to get out of here, but please join James Fetzer, Dr. James Fetzer, this coming Monday. Who else is going to be there again?
9 a.m. Well, Barr McClellan, Ed Haslam, Judith Very Baker, a host of others. It's going to be Roger Stone, among others, is going to be there. Yeah.
This is good. And if you guys want to check out more Dr. Fetzer, just go to moonrocksbooks.com.
Yes.
And you can get the books, and I know all your other books and information there.
Well, we're documenting how you can actually know the real history of the United States. I think the American people deserve to know the real history.
Of course. I mean, we've been taught
a lot of nonsense.
Yeah, for many
Searching for the truth, folks.
All right, well, go to our website, truthbetoldwebtv.com, and check out all of our upcoming guests coming on Truth Be Told. Go to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Leave a comment. We want to hear from you. All our shows are up there. And check us out on iHeart, on iTunes, Stitcher, all these other places that you can take us conveniently anywhere and listen to us. So until next time, this is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet.
And I'm Captain Ron.
And
Jim Fetzer, I look forward to coming back.
We have to do it for ourselves, Jim. I don't know what he's doing over here.
I'm delighted.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.